Good evening, everybody. It is wonderful to have you with us tonight to talk about our current exhibition, Norman Rockwell, Imagining Freedom, which actually just opened today. So we're so happy to have you with us. Actually, I guess it was yesterday. As you probably know, Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms are among the most recognizable and enduring images in the history of American art. They were inspired by Franklin D. Roosevelt's vision for a peaceful post-war world, and they are cultural icons that continue to resonate strongly today, just as they did in their time. First published in the Saturday Evening Post in the winter and spring of 1943, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear inspired American public in their time, just as they have a lasting global legacy in our world. In addition to Rockwell's Four Freedoms paintings, which are jewels of our collection, Norman Rockwell, Imagining Freedom, as the show is called, comprises more than 150 works from public and private collections, including paintings, drawings, photography, and prints by Rockwell, his contemporaries, and by artists who created work focusing on their interpretation of freedom today. The exhibit was originally titled Enduring Ideals, Rockwell, Roosevelt, and the Four Freedoms, and it opened at the New York Historical Society in May of 2018 after an extensive planning process, which Jim and I will tell you a little bit about as we go through. And it has recently returned home after a 2.5-year tour that took the exhibition to Detroit, Washington, D.C., Normandy, France, Houston, and Denver. It was an exciting team effort, and I really want to express appreciation to my brilliant co-curator, Dr. James Kimble, who is on with us this evening. I am so thankful for his partnership and collaboration. Jim is a professor within the College of Communication and the Arts at Seton Hall University. And he is a specialist in the study of domestic propaganda and visual rhetoric, right up our alley. He has been a Fulbright teaching scholar and the director of forensics and speech at George Mason University. And he has a new academic journal coming out focusing on homefront studies. And that will soon be available through the University of Nebraska Press. And Jim is actually from Nebraska, so that has to be a proud opportunity. Many thanks to director Lori Norton Moffett, who's joining us this evening. She has been central to this project and a great inspiration, and also to Rich Bradway, who's working behind the scenes. Rich really worked tirelessly to put together a series of terrific videos and interactive elements that really have enhanced the exhibition. And they and many other resources can be found on the museum's website. And I'll just mention, we're working on a wonderful series of programs, and I hope you'll join us for those. My colleague, Mary Burley, Chief Educator, is also behind the scenes, as is Alyssa Stubel, who oversees communications. And we are very happy to have you with us. As you will hear in a moment from Jim, President Roosevelt made clear that the Four Freedoms were no vision of a distant millennium. Their odyssey did not end with FDR, nor with Rockwell. The aspirational ideas put forward in their expansive vision are concepts that we continue to strive toward and that we try to make a reality for all people today. We will look forward to your questions during this program. We'd love to have a conversation if there are things you'd like to talk about. And you can do that by either placing your questions in the chat, and Mary and Alyssa will be looking for them and bringing them forward to us. So Jim, I wonder if you'd like to start with President Roosevelt himself and the important history of the speech.
I sure can. I should mention, though, just to divert briefly, that you didn't have a chance to introduce yourself. So everyone, you probably knew this, but Stephanie Plunkett is the chief curator at the Norman Rockwell Museum, and everything there goes through her. She's vitally important to everything that museum does. And the collaboration that I was able to have with her and her team over these last couple of years has been tremendous. So
thank you, Jim.
Wonderful to be a part of this group. So as you suggested, it all begins with this speech. You can see on the slide here where President Franklin Roosevelt is speaking his message to Congress, which we today call the State of the Union address, on January 6, 1941. Now, those of you who are history majors, or you've memorized the date of Pearl Harbor, you'll know that that's before Pearl Harbor, about 11 months before Pearl Harbor. And yet the war is ongoing, primarily in Europe and in Asia, and there's a big debate about whether or not the United States should be involved. In this speech, FDR utters for the first time the four freedoms, and he positions them as a sort of set of war aims, that if the United States were to become involved in the war, that it would be useful for them, the United States, to fight on behalf of. He uses the phrase everywhere in the world each time he mentions those four freedoms. What were they? They were freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. So we'll be talking about those four freedoms as we go on this evening. So the first of them that he utters, and the one that is probably the most memorable, is called freedom of speech. And here you can see, excuse me, Norman Rockwell's interpretation of freedom of speech. And we'll get more into the story of how Rockwell gets involved in these four freedoms. But from the outset, I think it's clear to say that when FDR said them in early 1941, he had this idea that they were going to catch fire, that they would be this amazing phrase that everyone would have on their lips. And it really didn't turn out that way. They became known, but not really admired or adored for over 2 years. And not until Rockwell came out with his interpretations, you can see from the slide there, over 2 years later, in February 1943, do they gain a much wider currency and popularity. And you can see from this first one reason why. Rockwell made these four freedoms tangible. He made them relatable so that people at home viewing them in the Saturday Evening Post, where they were first published, could relate to them. In this case, the first one, a blue-collar man standing up at a town hall meeting in New England, and all these folks wearing white collars are listening respectfully to his perspective.
And of course, Rockwell himself appears in this town hall meeting on the left-hand side. That's a great cameo appearance. Freedom of worship was actually a piece that Rockwell was very pleased with, but he did not start out with this iconic and spiritual portrayal. He actually began with the conception of an image that brought people of different faiths together in a barber shop, and realizing that that was maybe too lighthearted and stereotypical, he actually created something that was more symbolic of the variety, and beauty of a wide variety of ways of looking at spirituality and worship.
Mm-hmm. The third of the freedoms was freedom from want. And at least for Rockwell's interpretation, the painting that you see here, it was probably the most controversial, especially in Europe, because these come out in the middle of the war. And at this point in Europe, having a bountiful feast like this would have been unimaginable. People were literally starving. There just absolutely was no food. And even in the United States, where rationing was the order of the day, this kind of meal, this kind of feeling of safety was really an aspiration. It wasn't something that you could automatically have even in the United States in 1943. So there was some controversy on this one.
And freedom from fear, the last would initially look as though it was a domestic scene of parents checking on their children at night, until you see the headline in the newspaper that Rockwell has placed there, which basically says bombings and horror and hit, referring to the war in Europe that was going on and the concerns that any parent would have had for the future and the safety of their children. Rockwell was actually the father of 3 sons, and so he certainly would have identified with this point of view. He did say that every parent really should be able to put their children to bed at night and know that they would be safe. In order to establish a context for the 4 freedoms, we actually planned out the exhibition so that it would have 5 basic sections that take us essentially from the Great Depression through the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And as I'll show you later, there is a component that brings us right up until contemporary times. But the first is actually the war generation, which actually examines the national and global context for the 4 freedoms. So the struggles of the Great Depression, the looming threat of global war, domestic threats to freedom, such as Jim Crow policies and economic inequalities, are addressed in this section. And we see a group of photographs that were created during Roosevelt's New Deal with the Works Progress Administration. And this is a very famous photograph, you may have seen it, of Florence Owens Thompson, who was a migrant agricultural worker who had 7 children. And Dorothea Lange, the photographer, actually gave up her very successful photography business in San Francisco to take part in Roosevelt's program. And what these photographers did, so you had Dorothea Lange, Walker Evans, Gordon Parks, Arthur Rothstein, and others. They humanized the Great Depression, and they really gave a face, a personal face, to the people who were struggling. And here we see some photographs by Arthur Rothstein taken in reflecting upon the moment when many migrant workers in Missouri were actually put out onto the highway with all of their belongings because they had been working as sharecroppers, and by law were actually entitled to a percentage of both crops and subsidies, but many farm owners did not want to pay out those subsidies, so they literally kicked people off the land that they had been working on. And a very extensive series of photographs actually documents that. Jim, do you want to talk about the importance of fireside chats?
You bet. So radio is just emerging as an important medium in this era of world history. And President Franklin Roosevelt is the first to take advantage of it. So it's a very personal medium. As you can see from these pictures, families would gather around their single radio that was owned by the home. For my generation, the equivalent would have been a TV that we gathered around. But it was very personal because the president would be speaking, metaphorically perhaps, in front of a fireplace in the White House, and his voice would be projected across this broad country, going directly into the homes. And for a lot of these Americans, this was probably the first time they felt that bonding moment with the president. And it happened repeatedly. There were numerous fireside chats during the war, and it was a way for the president to really connect with the American people in the depths of the Depression. So also in this time period, we have the New York World's Fair in 1939, which was a very important historical moment. And what's of particular note in the context of this exhibition are the 4 sculptures that you can see on the left-hand side, the models put together by the sculptor Leo Friedlander, and on the right, the actual sculptures as they were on display at the World's Fair. What makes them interesting is that they were called the 4 freedoms. They were a different set of 4 freedoms, but they were 4 freedoms nonetheless. And we know from the historical record that when the World's Fair opened in 1939, who was there to give an inaugural speech? None other than President Roosevelt. And his speech was given right in the shadow of these sculptures. And so it's pretty clear that he would have been confronted very close, upfront and personal with four freedoms, even if they were slightly different from the ones that he would list as early as 1939.
Interestingly, too, I'll just mention that the four freedoms, as Jim said, were not the same as Roosevelt's. They actually came out of the Bill of Rights. So they were freedom of speech, press, religion, and assembly.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of terrific art actually came out of the Great Depression, but one of the standout cartoonists was Dennis Wortman, who did a lot of work for the New York World and other papers. And so he was creating kind of lighthearted imagery that focused on rather serious themes. So, for example, the drawing on the left said there was a time, Mopey, when being in the breadline was kind of exclusive. And that was in 1930. And then on the right-hand side, we see two men in an unemployment office. And one says to the other, "Thanks, Bill, I'd rather walk. It'll kill more time that way." So he's giving a nod to people's struggles in a way that was approachable and maybe even brought a laugh or two.
So those were an influential series of cartoons and imagery. And here's another influential artist, J.C. Leyendecker, who actually was Rockwell's idol in a way. He himself had over 300 covers for the Saturday Evening Post, and probably the most famous and certainly the most popular of Leyendecker's covers were known as the New Year's Baby. And we still have this tradition around. When you see a cartoon about the New Year's baby, coming in with the new year, this is where this idea comes from. So you can see two examples here, one from 1933, where you can see the baby charting the stock market and the hopeful ideal that it would turn up there. And then in 1940, expressing fears with the world seemingly going up in flames. Europe by this point is definitely at war and on a variety of fronts. You see the gas mask that the baby is wearing, and also the umbrella, which is an allusion to Neville Chamberlain at that point, the Prime Minister of the UK. And so definitely some images that were capturing what was going on in that moment.
So interestingly, despite the fact that there were terrible struggles in the nation, the magazines in America were presenting, many of them anyway, images that would be more lighthearted, more aspirational, and provoke good feeling and hope, essentially. So this concept of simple pleasures is something that comes up in Rockwell's work quite a bit in the 1930s. He actually only did one cover that referred to the stock market crash, and that was in 1929. But you'll see more typical work here. So on the left, despite the fact that the Depression is underway, this family has had a vacation and is clearly exhausted from the experience, with a deflated balloon and a frog trying to escape from the little boy's box, and clothes kind of stuffed quickly into a suitcase. But by 1938, Rockwell gives us another feeling, where we see a ticket agent who, no matter what he does, he can't seem to sell any tickets to any destination. And of course, I'll just mention that travel was a lifelong love for Rockwell. He even managed to travel during the Great Depression. He went to Europe in 1932. But here, clearly the Depression has had an effect on this man's business. Other simple pleasures like singing in a barbershop quartet were extremely popular from the late 19th century into the 1930s. In the image on the left-hand side, Rockwell's fellow illustrator from New Rochelle, New York, where he had lived for many years, is half-shaved. And it's a wonderful example of a piece from a private collection that has joined the exhibition and helped to enrich it so much. Mm-hmm. And of course, on the right-hand side, we see blank canvas or the deadline, and Rockwell-esque character really scratching his head to try to think about his next idea. And Rockwell had no shortage of work during the Great Depression. In fact, as the little clock on the upper left-hand side shows, he was constantly under deadline, which he called the scourges of an illustrator's life.
Well, that barbershop quartet cover was in late September 1939. Just less than a week earlier, this cartoon would have come out in September 20th, 1939. And of course, it's a reference to the Nazi invasion of Poland, which inaugurates World War II, at least in Europe. And here you can see some of these malevolent birds who are representing the Soviet Union and Stalin, as well as Nazi Germany and Hitler, crowing over the prostrate Poland. It's called A Funeral Oration for Poland, and by Hugh Hutton, it's quite impactful.
One of the hallmarks of this period was the entry of women into the workforce in very large numbers. So here we see Norman Rockwell's Liberty Girl, where he presents, as he often did, a very strong, determined woman who's capable of pretty much anything. He normally hired his neighbors and friends, but in this case, he did hire a professional model to play the girl next door, who has every possible piece of equipment to help her in her work. And as Jim will tell you, women in the workforce were often referred to as Rosie the Riveters.
Yes, they were. And if you all are looking at the screen here, you'll see two images, the one on the left and the one in the center. And I'm going to guess that almost all of you recognize one better than the other. We all today recognize the one on the left. So it's a poster by J. Howard Miller from 1943. But ironically, perhaps, during the war in 1943, the one that would have been much more familiar to Americans was the one in the center. That's also what's actually called Rosie the Riveter, and that's by Norman Rockwell. It featured on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post with a circulation of some 4 million Americans. And so it was widely known in Memorial Day, 1943, whereas Miller's poster was actually a Westinghouse Corporation product and was posted for only 2 weeks within Westinghouse factories in February 1943. And so it was seen by virtually no one outside of Westinghouse and quickly was thrown away. As far as we know, there's only 2 original copies that were saved, so it's quite rare. And there's been kind of a switch over the years. Now Rockwell's image is much less known, in part due to copyright concerns, whereas Miller's poster is seen as being unprotected, and so it's really exploded into our consciousness. And by the by, so you can see on the image on the right there, one of the reasons that Rockwell was such a genius is because he used subtlety in a lot of his messages. And so this cover, as you can see, was based on a religious allusion, referring back to the prophet Isaiah on the Sistine Chapel. So there's a classical art reference here suggesting all sorts of messages about Rosie and how great she is and what a saint she is.
And Jim, as I recall, you were actually featured in People magazine because you did an interview with a woman who is believed to be the model for J. Howard Miller's Rosie.
That was, yes, an episode a few years ago. There were lots of stories about who the woman in the We Can Do It poster is. And one of my research projects took that on as a task because the story was that there was this woman from Michigan who was the model. And my question was, well, how do we really know that? And I was able by basically following the archival trail to rule her out. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time to be able to have inspired this poster, and ultimately found another woman in California who may well have been the model. I'm not willing to say she was, but she was probably our best candidate. She herself made it into People magazine, so it was quite an event.
That's a great story. Rockwell actually did this this poster for the United States Army prior to working on his Four Freedoms paintings. It's called Let's Give Him Enough and On Time, and it really has to do with ensuring that the Americans working in factories were producing at a sufficient rate to keep the armed forces going. Rockwell went to tremendous lengths to be accurate in this piece. He actually requested that a gun be brought to his studio as well as an actual uniform, which he requested the right to rip and get dirty. He also asked if he could soil the gun as well to create the sense that the soldier was actually at war, but he was told that that would not be okay because a soldier would never allow their gun to go into disrepair or to become dirty. One thing that's interesting about this is it's the only piece that Rockwell ever did of a soldier in battle, and he did say that he never liked to portray violence, no matter the purpose. And after doing this, I think he had that sense that he wanted to do something more for the war effort and to make a larger, I think, and more meaningful statement that would have an impact.
Well, so far we've been walking through the first part of the exhibition, the war generation, where we tried to establish a context from which the Four Freedoms emerged. So now we shift over into the second section of the exhibition, FDR's Four Freedoms, really the inspiration for the Four Freedoms themselves. As I mentioned earlier, on January 6, 1941, in his message to Congress, the president first uttered those four freedoms. And each time he mentioned one of them, he said, everywhere in the world. On the right-hand side there, you can see in his secretary's hand, the passage, the Four Freedoms passage, which he made everyone in the Oval Office where they were writing the speech pause. And he said, I have an idea for an ending for the speech. And he reeled it off. He had clearly been thinking about it for some time, and it changed almost not at all by the time it got into the final draft of the speech. So, as I mentioned earlier, FDR really thought that these four freedoms were going to catch on, and they didn't really, for the most part, even though the administration did everything it could think of to try to publicize them. So, for instance, about 7 months later, in August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill held a secret meeting at sea off the coast of Newfoundland that came to be known as the Atlantic Charter. So an agreement between the United Kingdom, which was at war at the time, and the United States, which was officially neutral. And out of that meeting came, you see the document on the right, that document, the Atlantic Charter, which specifically mentions some of those four freedoms. And so that was perhaps an attempt by Roosevelt to build on this, what became a great event once it was no longer a secret, to build on those four freedoms and get them into public currency.
Jim, I wonder if you would just want to mention, because I may have missed a slide here, that the effort of the Office of War Information to try to get the word out about the Four Freedoms.
Certainly. So about a year after the Atlantic Charter meeting, the Office of War Information, which despite its title was really a propaganda agency, came out with a booklet devoted to the Four Freedoms. And incidentally, those of you who are fans of Charlotte's Web, it was primarily authored by a young author named E.B. White. So what it did was it tried to summarize the Four Freedoms for a wide popular audience. And unfortunately, not even the OWI's pamphlet caught on. It was published in some newspapers, but I have found almost no mention of it on the home front. So it was a dud, and it continued to be a dud.
One of the challenges to the concept of the Four Freedoms was actually occurred in 1942, just weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, when Roosevelt made the decision to intern Americans of Japanese descent with Executive Order 9066. And very sadly and unfortunately, about 120,000 people of Japanese heritage were taken, forced to leave their homes, their businesses, their schools, and to enter one of 10 internment camps that were situated in the Western United States. And you can see some images here. The one on the left by Dorothea Lange is very moving, where we see that there is a grocery store with a large sign, "I am an American." And then the barrack-like living quarters that would have been in those internment and also called concentration camps. One example there on the upper right from Colorado, and an image of the evacuation by train for many people to those camps. But interestingly, Gerald Ford actually repealed Executive Order 9066 formally in 1976, and his statement was very powerful. He said, "February 19th is the anniversary of a sad day in American history. It was on that date in 1942 that Executive Order 9066 was issued, resulting in the uprooting of loyal Americans. We now know what we should have known then. Not only was that evacuation wrong, but Japanese Americans were and are loyal Americans. I call upon the American people to affirm with me this American promise that we have learned from the tragedy of that long ago experience forever to treasure liberty and justice for each individual American, and resolve that this kind of action shall never again be repeated." Another challenge to freedom was discussed by many in the African American community, and particularly by the poet and activist Langston Hughes, who talked about something called double victory. The concept that the American campaign should be a double victory against fascism abroad and white supremacy and racism at home. And he wrote a poem that focused on Roosevelt's Four Freedoms. And you can see here, one of the pieces that we have in the exhibition is a photograph by Gordon Parks of Langston Hughes from 1943. But his poem is called "How About It, Dixie?" And it reads, "The President's Four Freedoms appeal to me. I would like to see those freedoms come to be. If you believe in the Four Freedoms too, then share them with me. Don't keep them all for you. Looks like by now folks ought to know it's hard to beat Hitler protecting Jim Crow. Freedom's not just to be won over there. It means freedom at home too, now, right here."
So you can see that people were thinking about the Four Freedoms in various permutations, questioning whether or not they applied to everyone, perhaps not to folks of Japanese descent, for example, or to African American communities. But even at the same time, people were also thinking, of course, about the military. And Rockwell was very involved in those sorts of discussions as well. In these two examples for his artwork depicting stages in the life of a young military man named Willie Gillis, not a real person, his fictional creation. The first the two appear was the one on the right, Willie Gillis Care Package. And this was just a couple of months before Pearl Harbor, when the military is starting to ramp up and people are increasingly involved in training. And you can see from the address on the care package that Willie is at Fort Dix, New Jersey, and he's received some goodies from home, and all of his buddies in the service are going to relieve him of those goodies fairly soon. So this lighthearted look into the life of the military became very popular. And it wasn't long after this cover appeared that the art director at the Saturday Evening Post got in touch with Rockwell and said, you know what, we'd like to have some more scenes from this guy. This is a big hit. And so Gillis appeared in, and Stephanie, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, it's at least 10, I think it may be 11 more covers throughout the course of the war, and even one after the war. The image on the left was actually one that was not published by the Post. I don't know if we know exactly why they rejected it, although we can speculate. We do see some soldiers smoking in the background there, and that might have, in the eyes of the Post, been a negative image of the military that they didn't want to send out to millions of subscribers. And also, Willie himself there looks pretty innocent and childish, and that might not have been something they wanted to show either.
Not to mention that he's wearing a rabbit's foot around his neck, which does not necessarily bode well. Jim, I wonder if you just want to mention the notion that the Army was at the time segregated, the armed forces.
The armed forces were entirely segregated. And so if you were, a young African-American growing up and you wanted to fight on behalf of your country, you could enlist, but you would end up in a unit like the ones you see pictured here. And for the most part, you were rarely involved in actual combat. You were confined to more service support roles. And it was just harder for that population to be able to contribute because of the de facto segregation and even Jim Crow policies within the military itself. And that wasn't addressed until after the war, when President Truman desegregated the military. But even then, there was a lot of struggle against that. So this is the third section of the exhibition. As I mentioned, Roosevelt really wanted his four freedoms to become this de facto war standard that was on everyone's lips, but it, for whatever reason, didn't seem to happen early on. But Roosevelt was smart. He knew when it was time to ask for help. So in 1942, he actually is on record as saying that he would challenge artists of all sorts to illustrate, to exemplify, to show examples of the four freedoms, whether in stone, whether in oil, or any medium that you can imagine. And so what you see here is a Four Freedoms monument by Walter Russell, who responded to FDR. And this was actually dedicated at Madison Square Garden in 1943. Currently, it's in Florida. Another example is the Polish refugee Arthur Szyk, who regarded himself as FDR's soldier in art. So here's another example of an artist who was well known at the time. He had multiple covers on Collier's magazine, and he was well known for making fun of Hitler and Stalin. But here you see four examples of his interpretation of the four freedoms that Roosevelt had uttered a year earlier.
Boris Artzybashev was one of the illustrators who was working essentially as a political cartoonist and doing very strident proclamations against totalitarianism. He was actually an artist who originally came from Russia. And here we see that he has taken a very strong view of Hitler and his cronies, actually using the symbol of the swastika to exemplify, in a sense, the twisted nature of what they were trying to accomplish. This is an illustration that was published in Life magazine in September 1942. So you can see that there are artists who are working really in a different realm than Rockwell, who was presenting a more positive view of America and the American home front. And here we see an artist who's really railing against the unfortunate events by a dictator. A very close friend of Norman Rockwell was Mead Schaefer. And in fact, as Rockwell tells it, he and Meade Schaefer traveled to Washington, D.C., where they were both really wanting to help with the war effort and to work with the government to do something, whether it be posters or other helpful projects with their work. Schaefer actually wound up doing a series of very strong post covers that show the American Armed Forces in all of their various units in heroic roles. And you can see here, or can imagine maybe if you were a member of the public, that seeing these strong images of such competent soldiers gave people a sense of, I'd say, confidence, and that things were in very good hands. Thomas Lee was an illustrator as well as a soldier, and he was a journalist who, while overseas, met a soldier who had been through battle, who had what we now know as the 2,000-yard stare. That being the look of a soldier who's completely removed or had to remove himself from the really tragic events that he was enduring. And so it really shows the psychological distress that many soldiers feel while in battle, and even afterward, that we now refer to as PTSD. So a very strong piece that's owned by the US Army.
Mm-hmm. So here you see what I think is a fascinating glimpse into the inner workings of Rockwell's process. So this is sort of a before and an after, you might say. The image on the left is war news, and you can see from the caption there that it was unpublished, in part because the art director at the Saturday Evening Post felt that it was difficult to figure out what really was going on. Well, what's going on, it's called war news, so you can probably guess, is that these folks at the diner are listening intently to the news coming from the radio, the war news. The radio's over the right shoulder on the top right of the image here. But to the art director, that just wasn't very clear what was going on here. And so that was passed over. As a follow-up, then, Rockwell goes with the image on the right. And it's the same idea, but you can see it's much clearer. First of all, our father, who's has 3 sons in the service, you can see from the 3 stars on the bulletin board there, is listening intently, ear up to the radio for the latest war news, and even has maps trying to chart where his sons are in the service. So it's a much clearer version of the same idea. So I mentioned earlier that Roosevelt had challenged the artistic world to illustrate the 4 freedoms in whatever medium they worked in. And so musicians responded to that challenge as well. So while you're walking around the galleries at this exhibition, and hopefully you all can go, you will hear samples of artists whose music responded to the 4 freedoms. Perhaps the most famous, and the song that you still hear being played today, was by Aaron Copland. His Fanfare for the Common Man was a response, direct response to the 4 freedoms.
And of course, posters were a tremendous aspect of communication during World War II, as they were during World War I. They were really calls to action in a very wide range of subjects. So on the left-hand side, we see a poster by the noted American photographer Valentino Sarra, who says, give them the stuff to fight with, meaning that keep the munitions coming. And on the right-hand side, we see a piece called This is Nazi Brutality by Ben Shahn, who was known as a social realist and who was actually noted by Norman Rockwell when he was painting his own Murder in Mississippi painting. He said he felt that he wished he had a little bit of Ben Shahn in him. Well, as you can see, this is the series of Norman Rockwell's 4 freedoms, and this is a significant aspect of the exhibition because it really looks at how the Four Freedoms came to fame, as Jim has been discussing, and how a tour, an exhibition actually brought them around the country in a way that raised more than $132 million towards the war effort. We look a little bit at Rockwell's process in this exhibition. You know, we're so fortunate to have this study in the show because shortly after Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms were delivered to the Saturday Evening Post, which was then in Philadelphia, unfortunately, his entire studio burned to the ground. And it's very likely that his reference materials and any other studies that he may have created would have gone right up in flames. But you can see here that this is freedom of speech from a very different point of view, where we see the speaker literally surrounded by the people who are listening, and we get to observe all of their expressions and emotions. Some are bored, some are smiling, some are maybe a little frustrated. So Rockwell realized that he needed to create something a little more graphically clear and something that would really emphasize the role of the speaker in his piece.
So he worked a long time on those Four Freedoms, and he actually lost weight in the process. But ultimately, after a number of months, they were ready, and he took them to Philadelphia, where the headquarters of the Saturday Evening Post was at the time. And the editor there, Ben Hibbs, just loved the images and insisted that they would be published right away. So in February and March of 1943, in 4 consecutive issues, the Saturday Evening Post published Rockwell's interpretation of the Four Freedoms. And although numerous other artists did interpret the Four Freedoms, as we've shown, these quickly became the best known of the era, in part because the Saturday Evening Post had such a wide reach, but also because Rockwell was really renowned and beloved by so many Americans. So as I said, 4 consecutive issues published them. And the Post went a little bit further in its publication. It didn't just print the images. It also, for each of the images, each of the freedoms, included an essay on the left-hand side of the page describing an interpretation in prose of that particular freedom. And for 3 of the Four Freedoms, it selected incredibly well-known writers, Booth Tarkington, Will Durant, Stephen Vincent Benet, among them a number of Pulitzer Prizes that they had already won in their careers. But the 4th one was a little bit different. The artist, or the writer, I should say, who wrote for Freedom from Once, yes, he wrote for Freedom from What, was Carlos Bulosan. We have a slide for him, right, Stephanie?
We don't, I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But he was an amazing poet. He
was. So he was a Filipino immigrant and a labor union activist. And it was really unusual that he was the choice. So first of all, it was a bit of diversity in a time when you didn't see a lot of diversity in this lineup of authors. But also, the Post was famously conservative, and it catered very much to that audience. And here was this labor union activist, this Filipino immigrant that's appearing in the pages of the Saturday Evening Post. So it was really very left field in some ways, and yet he offered a great explanation of freedom from want.
We had a wonderful visit from, interestingly, his nephew just recently. And he did mention that, of course, Carlos Sampayan Bulosan is truly a Filipino hero, and there is hope to open a museum inspired by his work. So hopefully that will happen someday.
Great.
The Four Freedoms War Bonds show was a rather extraordinary event. Shortly after the publication of the Four Freedoms in February and March of 1943, it became very evident that they were extraordinarily popular. People began to write to the Post for reproductions of the images. So eventually the Saturday Evening Post and the Treasury Department banded together to plan a very extensive war bonds show where about 1,000 objects, artworks, Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms, there were cartoons, there were manuscripts, would travel the country to 16 cities, and that people who purchased war bonds could receive a set of the Four Freedoms prints. So what you see on the left-hand side is Norman Rockwell at the opening venue in Hecht's department store. That was in April of 1943. And that was the only venue he actually went to personally. But every venue was very elaborately planned. There were celebrities, there were parades, many performances, and each city vied to raise the most money in war bond sales.
In many ways, that tour is the spiritual predecessor to the current exhibition, with its tour. So there were also posters, of course, to the tune of 4 million. So the Office of War Information really celebrated this popularity that was unexpected in some ways from them in the administration by plastering the Four Freedoms as many places as they could get it. In fact, it's not unusual if you go back to photographs of the home front from 1943 onward to see on the wall behind the people who are posing for the photo one or more of the Four Freedoms by Rockwell. So they were just absolutely popular. You would have them in your homes, on your wall.
And according to the Post, they received about 60,000 letters about Rockwell's Four Freedoms, which is quite amazing. Most were from everyday people. Some were from famous individuals, such as the one on the left from Walt Disney, who was actually a close acquaintance of Rockwell's and who commented that he particularly loved Rockwell's freedom of worship. On the right-hand side, there is a man from Minnesota named Carlton Wells, who wrote, "Your great pictures will help much to keep America's head high and its purpose true." And apparently Wells had children who were in the armed forces.
Mm-hmm. So that was Rockwell's Four Freedoms. The exhibition now turns to freedom's legacy, because those Four Freedoms didn't just persist during the war and then were forgotten about. They have a long post-war trajectory as well. Here in this image, you can see Eleanor Roosevelt, who served as her husband's proxy, you might say, because of course he didn't live to see the end of the war. So she ended up serving in his stead and promoting the Four Freedoms with the brand new United Nations. And through her steadfast leadership, she is credited with making sure that the Four Freedoms are listed specifically, all 4 of them, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is one of the central documents to this day of the United Nations.
Rockwell II felt quite passionate about the United Nations. And here, in the middle of the Cold War and 2 years into the Korean War, he created a drawing in which he essentially places the peoples of the world behind 3 delegates of the United Nations Security Council. And he, I think, felt that it was a very significant idea to bring forward, but could not fully grasp how to create something that would work as a published illustration. And this was very much an outgrowth, I think, of the feeling that he had about his Four Freedoms, which is that he wanted to make a larger statement that would have impact in the world. It was a time when he was already a very famous illustrator who had the trust of the American public. And I think he wanted to make the most of that to create statements that really dealt with humanistic themes. Eventually, several years later, actually about 8 years later, he began work on a painting that was a streamlined version of the piece that I just showed you, called Golden Rule. And this was a cover illustration for the Saturday Evening Post in 1961. And what I think he felt strongly about here is that every culture, essentially, or many, many cultures, have their own way to think about the concept of the golden rule, which is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And so this notion of fairness and equality within the world is something he really wanted to bring forward here. And you can see that in addition to his theme of multiculturalism, he brings forward the idea of the next generation, because the painting actually includes, I think, 5 mothers and their children. So thinking about the world that we are actually leaving to our children. And one very nice note is that in the upper right of this piece, we see his wife, Mary Barstow Rockwell, who had died in 1959, a little bit before this painting was published. And here she holds her first grandchild, Jeffrey Rockwell, who unfortunately she never had a chance to meet, but Rockwell brings them together here.
When Rockwell published the image that you just saw, he was reaching the end of his career at the Post, in part because the 4 freedoms back from 1943 were a turning point of sorts for him, in that he became increasingly interested in making a statement with his art, and not just being someone whom everyone who subscribed to the Post would look forward to seeing what humorous thing he could do, but being involved in social issues. And that really wasn't possible at the Post with its particular circulation and the audience it was appealing to. And so by the early 1960s, he was transferring over to Look magazine. And this is one of his earlier images for Look. And you can see that it's rather provocative. It depicts a day, or a moment, if you will, in the life of Ruby Bridges, a young elementary school student who was the first to desegregate a segregated school in New Orleans, and obviously for quite a long time faced a lot of opposition. In fact, she was escorted, as the image here shows, to and from class every day by U.S. Marshals.
These are just a few photographs from Rockwell's process. He actually interviewed, kind of tried out 3 different local girls to consider which would be the best to portray the subject. And he ultimately chose a little girl named Linda Gunn, and we were very fortunate to acquire the white dress that you see there. That is a dress that Rockwell actually had sewn in 3 different sizes for his 3 different models. But this was the one that Linda's mother kept so beautifully preserved in a plastic bag, and that we now have as part of the exhibition. It's very special.
So it's clear that Rockwell was increasingly interested specifically in civil rights and all that was going on in the United States in the 1960s. And here you can see one of his most powerful and visceral images, which documents the violent death. This was a real event that he was reacting to, of 3 civil rights workers at the hands of Mississippi law enforcement. They were in Mississippi to register voters. And so this was a very eloquent testament to the violence that these civil rights workers faced.
And here we see President John F. Kennedy, who actually created the Peace Corps, which he believed would promote understanding and peace between nations through its youth. And this was published on the cover of Look magazine for the 5th anniversary of the Peace Corps.
That civil rights era also overlapped with the Vietnam era. And here you see Rockwell's nod to the importance of that, of citizens having the right to know that the government has a responsibility to share information with the public. Again, in the context of Vietnam, in the context of civil rights, it's really an eloquent statement.
And if you think back to Norman Rockwell's Freedom of Speech, where we see him make a cameo appearance, here we see Rockwell with his pipe on the right-hand side, where he is joined together with his fellow citizens to ask the questions that every citizen should ask.
Now, to fast forward a couple of decades, a lot of these ideals are memorialized in this park. So if you've been to New York City lately, perhaps you've visited this park, or you may have overlooked it. It's on, ironically, Roosevelt Island, or fittingly, Roosevelt Island, the very southern tip, and it is Four Freedoms Park. And as you enjoy walking around the park, you'll notice that in the distance there, just across the river channel, is the United Nations itself. And so it's really a fitting tribute in the shadow of the United Nations that the Four Freedoms themselves helped to inspire. We've memorialized these four freedoms and Roosevelt, the president who first uttered them.
And with that, I'd like to just show you a few of the contemporary artworks that are in our exhibition that bring the concept of freedom up to date. We did a call for entries to invite artists working in all media to think about what freedom means to them. And so there's some wonderful examples that came in. We received more than 1,000 entries and had the very hard task of narrowing things down to about 40. But they are really a great diversity of works, including the piece that you see here by Pops Peterson called Freedom from What? And we see a family, an African-American family in a similar pose to that of Rockwell's Freedom from Fear, except on the newspaper, the headline reads, "I can't breathe." And interestingly, that was created in 1914 in response to the situation that brought Eric Garner into conflict with the police. And unfortunately, there is an example of a similar incident recently with George Floyd. So it gives us that sense that the concept of the Four Freedoms still evolves, and we still have quite a bit of work to do. Here we have a piece by Catherine Scott focusing on the Women's March. A woman's place is in the resistance. A piece by Robert Selby focusing on the Negro Leagues in baseball. Chris Hopkins, a painting, beautiful painting that was themed around the Japanese internment. Bree Hermanson, an illustrator whose To Have and to Hold looks at marriage equality. Gary Bist, who was reacting to the plight of refugee families, in this case in winter. And Felice House, who portrayed a Syrian woman in response to the conflict in Syria. Basalat Sukian, who is focusing on freedom of religion. And just a couple of examples from a recent project of the museum called the Unity Project, in which we had the exciting opportunity to invite 6 contemporary illustrators to create posters, original posters, focused on the idea of getting everyone to vote. So here are 2, the one on the left by Miley Degnan, And the one on the right, you might connect to that great Rosie the Riveter that Jim was talking about. This one is by Tim O'Brien. And we'll just end with a couple of inspirational quotes. Jim, you want to read these quotes?
Sure. So this exhibition really is in some ways about the dynamic between President Roosevelt and Norman Rockwell, the artist. So here, the quotation is from Rockwell himself expressing his desire to do something bigger than a war poster, a statement about why the country was fighting. And so his attempt to illustrate the four freedoms was a real success by that standard. The second quotation is from Roosevelt, the person who first uttered those four freedoms. And so this quotation was published in the tour book for the original tour, where Roosevelt expressed his appreciation for what Rockwell had done in illustrating those four freedoms. He's grateful. He's done a superb job, and he brings home the plain, everyday truths behind them. Not even the Office of War Information and E.B. White had been able to do that, but Rockwell was able to do it. And finally, we have a quotation from Ambassador Vanden Heuvel, who gives us an overall perspective, telling us that the four freedoms bring the past and the present together. We fought for them, and they're inscribed in the Charter of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and looking forward, they're the fundamental values of the world we leave to our children, those future generations.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. It has really been wonderful to do this project with you. And we are going to be thrilled to have the exhibition on view through January 18th. There'll be some terrific programs coming up. So we hope that you will check the museum's website at nrm.org. And in addition, there are very informational and interesting videos that you can find there, and a lot of other material that may serve as resources if you're further interested in this subject. But we were so happy to spend the evening with you, and we thank you so much for tuning in. Have a great night.
We may have some questions, possibly.
Let's see. Looks like we must have covered absolutely everything. And I'll just mention that the Norman Rockwell Museum is dedicated to the art of illustration in all of its variety. And of course, Rockwell, as Jim eloquently pointed out, being a very practiced and accomplished illustrator, was the one who was able to bring those four freedoms forward in real time. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.